Okay, if we could get our panelists up here. So we're going to have Trey Dickert, who's with kind of the hometown guy here. He's with Media 2 Interactive. We have Jared Lake, who's with Ocean Media, and Carlos Ramirez, who's with Quigley-Simpson. So this is appropriate because often when Steve introduces me, he talks about how long I've been in the business, and it kind of makes me feel old. And at some point I realized I've actually been covering this business longer than some of the people in this room have been alive. It's kind of messed up, but I want to just start up and set you up with some thoughts here, because when I started out in 1983 covering this medium called television, there were just 3 television networks. They had 200 brands advertising on it. That was it. 50 companies representing 200 brands. By the end of the 1980s, thanks to this thing called cable and satellite and more multi-channel, there was 4,000 brands using national television. So in preparation for this discussion here, I just want to think about how much more fragmented the media landscape got. If you start counting in OTT and subscription video services, not even including things like Spotify, which surprised me that now you even have audio doing video, as we saw this morning. There are now 5 million brands advertising on video. So it's a hyper-fragmented marketplace. So I kind of wanted to lead off with, we have agency planner, strategists, thinkers here from 3 different types of agencies. I'd like them to introduce themselves, but open with a leading question about how do you think about OTT in your mix? You know, fundamentally, this is about planning media mixes and buys and strategies. So if you could talk about what is the role of OTT in that mix, and then I'll have a follow-up question on that. So we could do linear because we're talking about a non-linear medium.
I'm Trey Dickert. I'm a media director at Media 2 Interactive out in Raleigh, so short drive. As far as how it kind of plays into our overall mix, it really works as a supplemental, supporting all of our both traditional and programmatic TV campaigns, looking at very small niche channels in order to support that higher engagement of that audience.
Hi, my name is Jared Lake, VP of Digital Strategy at Ocean. So at Ocean, our wheelhouse, if you will, is really sort of cross-channel video, media planning and buying. And so we look at, OTT as obviously a component of that in the sense of where are we going to find eyeballs in a cord-cutting, cord-never, light TV viewer environment. It's a piece of the puzzle, obviously, not the whole puzzle.
Right. My name is Carlos Ramirez. I'm the group director at Quigley-Simpson, overseeing media strategy and communication planning. And I would second that in terms of OTT being a part of the overall video strategy. And for us, for a lot of our clients, we see it as an extension of our TV planning campaign because we know over time ratings are declining, cable subscriptions are declining, and it's not that these consumers are just going away. They are somehow screen time is increasing, so they're going somewhere. And OTT happens to be where we believe a lot of these consumers are going, so we need to be active in this space in order to stay relevant to these consumers, especially the younger cord-nevers that never had a cable subscription. And what some of the research that we've seen is that cord-nevers and cord-cutters behave differently in terms of what they're seeking for from OTT.
Okay, so I heard supplemental, I heard a part of a mix, I heard an opportunity to reach an audience whose behaviors might be changing. So a lot of that does sound like how cable TV started out in the early 80s. And in the beginning of that era, broadcast made a lot of noise about why it's inferior, not as good. But the cable industry pushed back with the idea that, as Carlos was saying, that you're not reaching an important audience here, that there's an under-delivery, there's a behavior changing, and I think we're at the same point now. So here's my next question. It really wasn't until an ad agency called Ted Bates, which no longer exists, but it was one of the biggest, put a line in the sand, and they said, they called it the 5% solution. They said, cable is now reaching critical mass. A lot of households are watching TV through it. We need to plan at least 5% of our budget to reach those audiences. The funny part is, at that point, cable wasn't even at 50% of US households when they did that. Right now, according to the most recent Nielsen data, subscription video services are in 66% of US households, so about 2/3, and it's growing 10% a year. So let me ask you, do you have a number? Is there an appropriate percentage that we should be thinking of OTT as part of your mix?
I'll start. So it's funny that you say 5%. So as part of the upfront process that probably many of us are going through right now, we had to plan next year sort of, allocations from a video perspective for many of our clients. And so the way that we, looked at that universe is obviously linear TV, encompassing obviously upfront commitments, also scatter, advanced TV, programmatic, et cetera. Programmatic video as a bucket, and then, connected device or OTT, VOD, we kind of put it all in the same bucket, or i.e., direct buys for sort of full episode player. In terms of that planning exercise and it determining, how we're gonna reach the right person in what environment, kind of basically landed at 5% or so, for most clients and in most of those exercises.
I'd say for my clients, it kind of depends on the specific objectives and KPIs, because we have some really big clients that have really broad demos. So like women 25 to 54, and they're going after, they're using OTT to extend the reach and go after the part of their audience that they're missing with linear TV. So that strategy is going to be very different from a startup that we're working with that has a very limited budget, and the OTT folds more within their digital strategy, and they're getting hyper-targeted. So OTT may represent, a much bigger mix, 30%, 25% of their overall spend, whereas with a larger marketer that has a broader demo, it may only be about 5%.
So for a few of our clients, we've actually have set display budgets, TV budgets, and then print budgets. But then out of those TV or video budgets that we have allocated, it's usually about a 40% towards national TV buys and 60% towards basically everything else. And then we just fluctuate the actual allocations during the year based on how many transactions are coming through.
Okay, so within that, are you thinking of OTT as a hybrid medium called TV, video, other, and advanced video experiences, or as part of a total media mix? It sounds like you're more of TV, all other, and OTT falls in all other. It sounds like you're thinking more like this is another day part. Do I have it right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know, OTT is a loosely used term that probably helps to define, or at least, how we define it. For us, the way that we think about the universe of video, right, from a planning perspective is, you have traditional linear, which within C3, C7 does include obviously some time shifted. Within that, again, advanced TV, programmatic, addressable, so on and so forth. Programmatic video largely being occupied by, mobile and desktop, Facebook and Google primarily. And then connected device, and with that, it's obviously the network-owned and operated apps, so that, the NBC, ABC, et cetera, that you're watching on your connected devices. But we think about it more, I guess, from a content perspective and sort of where you're getting the content from, and less, to a certain degree, the device. But obviously, when we're buying, cross-screen with an NBC or an ABC, that's going to include some mobile and desktop inventory. The reality is the larger, as probably many people in this room know, the larger majority of where their impressions are falling within that universe is on connected devices, so to speak, and that certainly represents the longer term growth as well.
Yeah, for us, full episode players tend to be what we gravitate towards at the moment, because we do see that engagement being a little bit higher than in the short form. And one of the things that we've seen with people who are cutting the cord is that they're looking for replacements of that experience in the living room. And so that's where we want to be. Not to say that there's not a place for the shorter form publishers like YouTube. I think that the younger, the brands that have a younger demo, definitely that's a space where we need to be in. But there are other concerns as well, like brand safety. So some of our clients are very conservative, and having those direct-to-publisher relationships with FEP providers allows us to have a lot of control over the kind of programming that we're going to be running alongside of. But I think it's got to be a strategy that's curated to the objectives and the parameters of each client.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why we kind of divide out ours between standard linear TV and then basically all other video elements is just the trackability. So with TV, we get log files from the various networks, but with all the other, say, digital or OTT components where we have a little bit more tracking through third-party tracking capabilities, that gives us a better data set to actually look at return on ad spend towards those various channels.
So I want to come back to trackability because I know it's really important to you and to you as well, to everybody. But I just want to follow up on the definition because I think it is important that we have all these ununified experiences going on. When going back to cable, when it came out, the big differentiator was, it was a coaxial line into the house versus a terrestrial line, but the consumers didn't know the difference. It was television or HBO or ESPN or CBS. So right now in my home, I have a Roku TV connected to a TiVo device with a Chromecast attachment and a Fire Stick on it. I don't know, and I'm a pretty tech-savvy guy, what the heck I'm watching at any point except the content and the experience that I'm, whether it's a Netflix or ABC to go or whatever it is. So I think what you're saying is we're kind of reverting to a contextual strategy where it's the format, the player, the content experience that's the discriminating thing, not the technology.
Yeah, it's the software. From a purist, what software, what service is delivering that? Less so about the actual device or the hardware. The device or the hardware is commoditized, right? It's really about who is providing that service and who is providing that content to the end consumer. I think one of the challenges at least from my perspective in the OTT space or the connected device space is the fragmentation, right? No individual sort of provider or sort of network group or whatever can really provide a tremendous amount of scale from a buyer perspective, especially when you start to go down the path of I want to have things be targeted or I want to target this very specific audience, and then that becomes I think that's one of the primary challenges that from an ecosystem perspective needs to be addressed and is being addressed, so that from as advertisers, as buyers, we can go out there and say, hey, we want to find new moms that are in market to buy strollers or whatever, and buy that across several different providers. At this stage, if I want to have that conversation, I got to go talk to NBC and ABC and Hulu and whatever else, and try and piece all that together in a way that's meaningful. And quite frankly, for the amount of scale that I can get out of that exercise, it may not be worth it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the previous panel touched up on the logistics and how difficult it can be to get everything going in the same direction and having one unified way of viewing your reach and frequency, but also managing the optimizations. I think that's still very labor intensive, still very manual. And we ran a brand study that showed that for one of our campaigns, after 7 exposures, brand favorability actually started decreasing. So we know that frequency is a problem for all advertisers, and it's something that we have to be very mindful of. And when you're in a fragmented marketplace and you're trying to manage against one demographic, it's very difficult to control frequency from that perspective unless you're working with one platform, but as Jared mentioned, that has scale limitations. So it's something that's still evolving, and I'm very hopeful that in the next few years we'll be able to figure this out.
But I guess all that being said, one of the benefits that I see, or that we see in general to this space, is that from a consumer perspective, it is a much better experience. It's a more premium experience. It's a lighter ad load. You're sort of on your own sort of time frame in terms of choosing and picking and watching what you want. And I think as advertisers, despite the challenges of scale and being able to track things and measure things and whatever else, that's probably a very good place to be for those reasons. You know, and generally that, that, at least from what we've seen, that aligns well with the demographics of that consumer. They tend to be sort of more affluent, have more disposable income, and also obviously attractive from an advertising perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. The research that we've done shows that light TV viewers and cord cutters, cord nevers, are a valuable demographic to reach. So every effort we can make to reach them is a good one. And one of the things that, for us, we're excited about OTT is in the moment is that we feel like it's a marketplace that hasn't been truly realized by advertisers. So advertisers are still trying to figure it out, and we're talking about some of the challenges. But with that brings opportunity, and what we've been able to do is leverage really efficient rates with some of our publishers and get some great added value that I don't know is going to be around in a year or two once the marketplace has caught up to the opportunity.
Well, it's really interesting what you guys point out about user experience, because a lot of, and this, by the way, I think is an excellent thing for OTT to lean into in terms of data privacy, because most of what you hear from digital media is we're going to give you more relevant messaging. They don't say anything about frequency capping and maybe reducing the amount of load on you. So if the reason you're collecting data is to manage the experience better, I think that's something the industry should crow about. But it points out this other point that Jared's highlighting, which is that in these environments you have lower commercial loads, you have more user control over the advertising experience. So here's the question I have for you. About 2 or 3 months ago, an industry executive, Rashad Tabakawala from Publicis, made a statement at a SIM conference about predicting that 30% of impressions would disappear in the next 5 years. What he meant by disappear is the users would either block them through technology like ad blockers, or they would shift to non-ad supported or lightly ad supported experiences like subscription video on demand with or without ads. So what does that portend for this medium if we're going to have a tightening of inventory, the inventory being defined as actually being able to access consumers?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. From my perspective, and I think anybody that represents a publisher or network out there, if there are any, there's a balance from both sides of the equation that makes sense, right? The reality is if there is less advertising inventory out there for advertisers to buy, which is therefore going to push pricing up, that's not a bad thing if I can get more effective advertising that works better, whether that's, that more than likely is going to be fueled through better solutions with data, so on and so forth. So I'm happy to, I shouldn't say that, but I'm open to paying more if it's going to be more effective, and I think obviously that benefits everybody in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we'll start to see is, the front-end metrics around CPMs are going to go up, but also the engagement metrics on the back end, whether it be actual transactions or lead gen, all those conversion rates are going to go up just because people are going to be a little bit more engaged in the actual ads themselves.
So we're going to see CPMs go up, but we're going to shift from a CPM to an more effective CPM.
That's the hope. I mean, hopefully it's in lockstep with with what we see in terms of engagement and conversions for our clients, and that's something that we'll have to monitor very closely as the ecosystem evolves.
Yeah, I was just going to add, when it comes to video, I mean, I think everybody in this room would agree that the best, at least from my perspective, the best sort of consumer experience out there is not ad supported, unfortunately. Like, you know, what Netflix does, both from a content perspective and from a consumer perspective, is, you know, they're kind of hitting it out of the park, and it doesn't appear as though there's going to be an opportunity for advertisers to play in that ecosystem anytime in the near future. So, you know, those that are still utilizing advertising in this space, you know, those that are providing content with advertising, you know, really need to invest in providing better solutions for advertisers to make that as effective as possible in order to properly compete.
Although I will say, as an avid sports watcher, I watch a lot of sports over connected devices, and I would rather have ads in the pods than a message that says, "We'll be right back," and some, you know, elevator music playing. And maybe that's just the advertiser in me, but you know, that just goes to show that they're not fully monetizing the space, and so there's a lot of opportunity there for advertisers.
Yeah, just to go back to early cable days, one of the first things you saw the trade press and industry execs pontificating on was, when would HBO take ads? That was in the early 80s. They still don't take ads. So let me ask you all, when will Netflix take ads?
I personally don't see it happening. Yeah. You know, I think, I mean, the business seems to be doing fine without it. And I think that, to be honest, I mean, it's very likely that it has a very detrimental impact on their business, because consumers have come to expect that that's an ad-free environment. They're obviously willing to pay for it. Those subscription prices may go up over time, but I think that, like, you know, I'll use Spotify as an example. Spotify has both options. Like, I pay for Spotify. I don't want to see those ads. It's a better experience.
So we're moving into a bifurcated world, well, actually a hierarchical world of ad-free subscription, some kind of freemium in between, and ad-supported media. Doesn't that create a new challenge for you to plan reach and frequency and all that good stuff? I mean, how do you, I mean, there's going to be cord cutters, and now there's going to be in-betweeners and every which wayers?
Yeah, so it's never going to be a person who's watching Netflix, for example, or even Hulu that has the premium service without ads. They're always going to be on some other channel as well. So we're still going to reach those people and those audiences. It just depends on whether or not it's contextually relevant.
So let's go back to tracking. You brought it up. So are you able to retarget people that you know are watching an ad-free experience in Netflix through some other channel? Do you have the ability to do that now?
Right now, we haven't found that technology. We do have the ability to impression-based remarket, but the person has to be served that ad in order for it to be, for them to be housed in our remarketing pool.
So using Axiom or some super big data database, you cannot identify and target those people now.
Yeah, but if you go back to the day in a life example that was made earlier, you know, you know, the reality is, although a lot of time is being spent on Netflix and maybe Spotify without ads, there's plenty of time being spent in environments that do still have ads. So as advertisers, it just makes it slightly more challenging, because that, you know, the time of day that is spent in ad-free environments may increase over time, you know, possibly. So it makes it more challenging for us to find opportunities in the time left. But there are still certainly times, you know, opportunities within that time that's left over.
Yeah, on the flight down here, I was reading this book that my daughter just graduated as an evolutionary biology major, and she turned me on to it. It's not a new book. It's a few years old. It's called The Sixth Extinction, right? And it's this idea that there have been 5 major mass extinctions on Earth, way before we were around. And there's this new one going on now that we're in the middle of. And the theory is we're actually creating it, right, because of whatever, climate change and things. So in some ways, I feel like we're in this 6th mass extinction of ad-supported media that we're creating ourselves through the propagation of all these channels and technologies. But in the end, I think we're going to have a healthier, smaller species of sorts, because this technology will mean there'll be just less inventory, higher CPM, more effective CPMs. But let's talk about how you actually measure the back end, right? So you mentioned trackability. I think in our prep calls, both you guys were, if it's fair for me to say, you're more performance-oriented, all about the outcomes, okay? No? Yeah.
Depends on the client,
Right.
but yeah.
And I believe you in particular, Trey, where you just don't buy them if you don't have the trackability, right? I mean,
Yeah, and that's one of the hard parts with a lot of our clients is they're looking at it from a return on ad spend. So whether it be linear TV or basically any type of media that we're buying, we have to track it back to whether it be a transaction, if it's an originating source through TV and how it influences branded search, and then remarketing campaigns. We have to track that all the way through their attribution funnel to see what's driving the overall return on ad spend.
can you give a case? It could be generic, brand A and platform C, but how you actually can carry through that exposure to the outcome.
Yeah, so we have a client in the outdoor space. They have a mix of national TV buys, connected TV, video, remarketing, basically a full media mix. Their national TV buys, when they originate traffic, it takes 180 days for that person to see their ad and actually go through and purchase their product. Once we started to build in connected TV into their campaigns, that overall video dropped down to, I believe, 47 days. So once we started to look at that impact and see, okay, connected TV is starting to drive a much shorter lag time from first touch to an actual transaction, then we've started to decrease their overall lag time to purchase and drive a little bit more efficient return on ad spend. But we have to be able to track it.
So it sounds like programmatic optimization where you continue to do what works and you pull back when it doesn't. I mean,
Exactly,
yeah. Okay.
yeah.
And for one of my clients, they had a very specific metric. They wanted to increase the amount of request to quotes through their app. And we had a local market test where we looked at the pre, the mid-campaign, and the post for that very specific function, and we ran connected TV messaging promoting that function. And what we saw was a significant lift through the life of the campaign and shortly thereafter. That's one of the things we can do is just isolate the variables, isolate the market and the specific messaging, and see what kind of response we're getting from an aggregate level.
Okay, I think we're getting too in the weeds because Steve gave me the prompt for the audience questions. So anybody have any questions about OTT, how agencies look at it, how it's part of the mix, what they're doing, what they should be doing, what they're not doing? Gentleman here.
So a lot of the premium in the my name is Swap. I work at McKinney. We're a full-service ad agency, and I specifically head up the media group there. As it relates to OTT, the premium and the pricing is already sort of built in because there's reduced ad load, because you could do a premium experience. You can let people only see one ad. You often see like a 300% increase in price, but maybe like a 30 to 50% increase in ad recall or whatever the metrics are that they show. And often what happens is the clients have you can try to justify the value of this impression as a better served one versus in a more cluttered environment. But what happens is the clients have sticker shock at that price, and then the performance on the back end is hard to get all the way down to the lower funnel metrics. And so you don't often see video driving efficient cost per transactions. It's more of like an awareness tool up front, right? So how do you guys coach your clients into thinking about the full picture and understanding what the various parts are, because it does get confusing?
Yes, I'll attempt to tackle that. So for connected device specifically, one method that we found to be somewhat successful in terms of addressing that, so pricing is important, obviously. If you start off at, from a CPM perspective at a base that's astronomical to begin with, you're going to be handicapped out of the gate in terms of, closing the gap on those performance metrics. That's just the reality. I think to Carlos's point, there's some elasticity in the marketplace in terms of, a lot of these publishers being able to properly monetize their inventory. And so, you know, some good negotiations can go a long way in that respect. We've been kicking the tires on quite a few of the ACR sort of, you know, vendors out there in the marketplace and really utilizing ACR to help understand. So for those who don't know, ACR is automatic content recognition using smart TV data to understand who's been exposed to ads. And so we've used that to sort of understand the relative difference in performance between sort of connected device and streaming inventory and then, you know, the overall TV or linear TV buy and help justify or highlight, you know, the sort of the benefit or the results of the channel as a whole utilizing that. Those solutions are not perfect. They're all relatively new from, you know, in terms of their product development, but we found that that can help sort of tell that story overall.
Yeah, and I think one thing that we've also done is just look at engagement rates and trying to back into what's the right eCPM for connected TV, because not every impression is created equal, and just because you're getting cheap impressions doesn't mean they're effective impressions. So, you know, every advertiser is different, but getting a sense for where their comfort level is and what makes the most sense in terms of the premium you're willing to pay, because there's still a premium, but I really do think that there is room for aggressive negotiation because you know, most of the publishers still have inventory that they need to liquidate, and you know, I think that that's a place of opportunity for marketers.
Carlos, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, one of the things that we've started to do is create micro attribution models that for clients that, you know, you can't see all the way down to the very bottom, you know, the lowest conversion metric, whether it be transactions or an actual contract is fulfilled. We've started creating micro attribution models that look at overall branded search lift based on your TV and video buys. So how the video is actually influencing people who are coming through branded search and engaging with your brand itself. That's what we've started to do on our side to help kind of measure and show a client, okay, while these CPMs are much, much higher than some of the other CTV content out there, it still influences a great deal of engagement on the back end.
Carlos, you mentioned before you're doing a lot of research on consumer behaviors on these channels, and I think you mentioned, I have it right that you mentioned that you were seeing a distinction between cord cutters and cord nevers. Could you tell us a little bit about that, and also whether you're doing any research on mobile?
Yeah, so what we've seen regarding cord cutters is that they tend to be a little bit older. They tend to be trying to replace the linear TV content with a patchwork of different apps and different subscriptions. Whereas cord nevers are younger. They tend to gravitate towards more short form content, and they also, you know, engage in a lot of the same subscriptions like Netflix that are pretty ubiquitous, but they have a higher propensity for consumption of YouTube and shorter form content, and they are not as, you know, they're not necessarily trying to replace cable subscriptions because they've never had one, and so I think knowing the differences and knowing who your target is, what bucket they fall into, or if they fall into both, is important because your tactics should change accordingly. And
well, actually, that point seems really interesting to me, especially in that it suggests we might have a generation coming up that is really not attuned to episodic formats at all. And that they actually have been trained by digital video to consume and think about the video experience differently.
Right.
How about mobile? Or I'm sorry, go ahead. I'm stepping on.
I mean, I'm just agreeing and nodding. I mean, I think you know, we should all be cognizant of that from a marketing perspective. Like the idea of like I'm going to tune in 9 o'clock to watch whatever show is kind of an antiquated proposition, particularly if you think about younger generations that are subscribing to channels on YouTube and, you know, binge watching on Netflix. And, you know, they don't, you know, I have very young children, but my kids have zero understanding of the concept of linear TV, and they will probably never have an understanding of what linear TV means, you know. But what they do know how to do is turn on the TV and go to Netflix and go watch Wildcrats or something, you know. That's their experience, and that's how they are consuming content. Those habits are only going to amplify over time. They're not going to regress, so to speak.
And my 4-year-old screams out every time he sees a commercial because he doesn't understand why it's happening, because we rarely put anything on that's on a linear TV, and most of what he consumes is on like Netflix or Sesame Street streaming. And so it's yeah, you're gonna see that kind of that generation grow up and kind of have a completely different experience when it comes to ads and
And a
being
different
served an ad.
expectation.
Exactly.
They have a different, I think they have a different, either an expectation not to have ads or an expectation that the ads are relevant to them or meaningful to them or help improve the experience.
It's a brand new baseline for that generation than what we're used to.
Well, what an interesting place to
Well,
go ahead.
if I can conclude, it is no longer Mr. Rogers' neighborhood.
Well, I mean, now, I mean, advertising has been accused of many things. Terrorizing small children is new. Joe, panel, thanks very much.
Thank you.